Hello, I'm Brad Kelly, and you're listening to Method and Madness. This is a show about books, the people who write them, and the labyrinth to be explored between the words.
Have you ever heard about Willie the Weeper? Had a job as a chimney sweeper. He had the dope habit and he had his band. Listen while I tell you about a dream he had.
Philip K. Dick's 1965 novel, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, is a strange, sometimes hilarious, and unsettling science fiction story set in the now-past future, in which temperatures have risen to such a degree that life on Earth is only possible with extensive air conditioning, temperature-regulating suits, and careful measures to avoid being outside for more than just a few minutes. Barney Mayerson is a precognitive working for a company called Perky Pat Layouts. His job is to forecast which products will be successful once they are minimized for use by off-planet colonists in conjunction with a translation drug called CAN-D, a drug which Mayerson's boss, Leo Bolero, a man who has pushed biotechnical evolution nearly to its limit, also sells on the black market, and which allows users to have a Barbie-like experience after a long day of toiling on Mars. But that's not the weird part, because Interplan industrialist Palmer Eldritch, or something that looks just like him, has returned from a 10-year sojourn outside of the solar system, and the new drug he's brought to market calls into question the nature of reality itself. I've got with me today Bram E. Gieben. He's a writer and critic who hosts the podcast Strange Exiles about ideas, identity, and ideology. He's also the author of The Darkest Timeline and the ongoing series you can find right now in his Substack, Crisis Masculinity, as well as a forthcoming book about Philip K. Dick. You can find him on Substack or Twitter. I'll have links in the show notes there. And folks, if you're listening to this, don't forget that premium subscribers to Method and Madness get early access to episodes like this, plus full access to the madness portion of the show. For this one, after Bram and I's conversation, I'll be recording a extended episode on PKD's exegesis, the lore of Stigmata. I'll be talking about some people who've actually lived or claimed to live in alternate realities, and much more. Bram, thank you for joining me. I really enjoyed talking with you a few months back on your podcast, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you about Philip K. Dick. Before we get into it, tell us, I want to make sure people who haven't come across you before are familiar with you and kind of direct them to some of your other work. Tell me a little bit about, I know, but for the audience, tell me a little bit about Strange Exiles.
Sure. So it's been going for a few years now. I kind of started it around the time of the COVID lockdowns. And it was a way to sort of reach out and have conversations with people and then kind of share those conversations. So I kind of made a list initially of like 4 or 5 people that I wanted to get on. I managed to get 3 or 4 of those people. One of them was the Dr. Peter Sjostet Hughes, who's written extensively about, he had a theory called neo-nihilism, the philosophy of power, which I really loved. And he wrote about psychedelics. So I think like the success of being able to get somebody who'd written a book I really loved, like really G'd me up to try and just be ambitious and reach out to people. And as it's gone on, I think like I've reached out less and less to sort of people who are reasonably well known in their fields, and I really just found people who kind of sit adjacent to the mainstream, or who are a little bit underground in whether, what they're interested in. I've had everybody from journalists who write about architecture to people who are involved in various kinds of social activism. I've had rappers. I've had lots of different kind of people on the show. So I guess the format of it is about exploring someone's life, their career, how they came to produce their work. So it's a deep dive that covers a great many topics rather than being a podcast about one topic.
Yeah. No, I love it. People should definitely go check it out. There's some great conversations in there. And tell us a little bit about the Crisis Masculinity project as well.
Sure, yeah. Right now. So that's kind of my second book. I made the decision to publish it on Substack because the topic of male identity and masculinity is obviously, very much on people's minds right now. You've got shows like Adolescence, which was a global breakout hit just for having a conversation about the pressures that young men face, the kind of malign influences that they encounter now online, particularly online. I didn't have necessarily a particularly tough time of it economically growing up. I was very privileged in that regard, but I did struggle at school. I've had my struggles with mental health. So in a way, it's a much more personal book than my first one, which was It's called The Darkest Timeline. It was kind of about the end of the world, cyberpunk, various ways of predicting the future. This one is much more about my experiences, but there's some interesting stuff in there. Like one essay that I've got coming up is about the performances of the actor Ryan Gosling, and in particular focusing on his performance in Barbie, which I think is something we might touch on today as we discuss Perky Pat. So it's good, and I've had really great response so far in the comments. People have been sharing their own stories. I'm going to be inviting some people to do some guest essays, expanding on some topics. It's exciting to publish something sort of live and actually see the feedback come in. It's very different. Like when I published The Darkest Timeline, I went on a little book tour, and everywhere I went, the book is quite negative. It's quite dark. But I would have these conversations where people would nonetheless say, so, where do you see hope? What's your actual hope for the future? Right. So those were really productive discussions, but they weren't recorded anywhere. So I think with the new one, those are happening on Substack, which is really quite exciting.
Cool. Yeah, very cool. Yeah, absolutely. And the part of the reason I'm excited to talk about Philip K. Dick and Palmer Eldritch with you, because I want to talk to you, but also after I reached out to you about talking about at least some Philip K. Dick book, you mentioned that you are actually in the process of working on a book about Philip K. Dick. I will probably get into some of the aspects of this, but can you give us the sort of high level, what's that going to be?
Yeah, for sure. It's early days yet. The working title is Arc Worlds. The phrase arc word is a recurring phrase that, crops up through a piece of work to signify one of the broader themes. And Philip K. Dick has some arc words in his books. He's kind of a fan of those. But I also think that like his themes are such, in a way, like, he writes about a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different fantastical concepts, but it's nearly always about that question of, is reality real? Like, can we trust our senses? What does it mean to be human? And I think those are really, really timeless themes. So what I've tried to do is sort of pick, maybe 8 to 10 of his books and really kind of dig into those themes a lot. And as I said, Barbie, the movie, I think is going to be playing a little part of the chapter about Palmer Eldritch. I think there's some really interesting parallels there. We live in a time where we are questioning our own realities. We do live in a time where the idea of the simulacra from Baudrillard, for instance, is increasingly relevant, the idea of hyper-reality. So I think it's a good time to sort of revisit Philip K. Dick, who's already very critically acclaimed, but is also just really still got something to say about the strange blend of reality and hyper-reality that we all inhabit.
I believe I know what happened, Leo said. He rang off. Barney went below with the Chew Z, he realized, and right away they all sat down and chewed. That was the end, just as it was for me on Luna. Our tactics required that Barney chew away, Leo realized, and so we played right into Palmer's dirty, semi-mechanical hands. Once he had the drug in Barney's system, we were through, because Eldritch somehow controls each of the hallucinatory worlds induced by the drugs. I know it, that the skunk is in all of them. The fantasy worlds that Chew Z induces, he thought, are in Palmer Eldritch's head, as I found out personally. And the trouble is, he thought, that once you get into one of them, you can't quite scramble back out. It stays with you, even when you think you're free. It's a one-way gate, and for all I know, I'm still in it now. However, that did not seem likely, and yet, he thought, it shows how afraid I am, as Ronnie Fugate pointed out. Afraid enough to, I'll admit it, abandon Barney there like he abandoned me. And Barney was using his precog ability, so he had foresight, almost to the point where it was like what I have now, like hindsight. He knew in advance what I had learned by experience. No wonder he balked. Who gets sacrificed? Leo asked himself. Me, Barney, Felix Blau, which of us gets melted down for Palmer to guzzle? Because that's what we are, potentially, for him. Food to be consumed. It's an oral thing that arrived back from the proc system, a great mouth, open to receive us. But Palmer's not a cannibal, because I know he's not human. That's not a man there in that Palmer Eldritch skin. But what it was, he had no concept at all. So much could happen in the vast expanses between Soul and Proxima, either going or coming. Maybe it happened, he thought, when Palmer was going. Maybe he ate the Proxman during those 10 years, cleaned the plate there, and so then came back to us. He shivered. Well, he thought, 2 more hours of independent life plus the time it takes to travel to Mars, maybe 10 hours of private existence, and then swallowed. And all over Mars, that hideous drug is being distributed. Think, picture the numbers confined to Palmer's illusory worlds, his nets that he casts. What do those Buddhists in the UN like Hepburn Gilbert call it? Maya, the veil of illusion. She-ute, he thought, dismally, and reached to snap on his intercom in order to requisition a fast ship for the flight. And I want a good pilot, he remembered. Too many autonomic landings of late have been failures. I don't intend to be splattered all over the countryside, especially that countryside. To Miss Gleason, he said, "Who's the best interplan pilot we have?" "Don Davis," Miss Gleason said promptly. "He has a perfect record, you know. His flights from Venus." She did not refer explicitly to their Can-D enterprise. Even the intercom might be tapped. 10 minutes later, the travel arrangements had all been made. Leo Bolero leaned back in his chair, lit a large green Havana leaf Claro cigar which had been housed in a helium-filled humidor, probably for years. The cigar, as he bit the end off, seemed dry and brittle. It cracked under the pressure of his teeth, and he felt disappointment. It had appeared so good, so perfectly preserved in its coffin. Well, you never know, he informed himself, until you get right to it. His office door opened. Miss Gleason, the ship requisition papers in her hands, entered. The hand which held the papers was artificial. He made out the glint of undisguised metal, and at once he raised his head to scrutinize her face. The rest of her. Neanderthal teeth, he thought. That's what those giant stainless steel molars look like. Reversion, 200,000 years back. Revolting. And the Luxvid or Vidlux or whatever they were, eyes without pupils, only slits. Jensen Labs of Chicago's product, anyhow. "God damn you, Eldritch," he said. "I'm your pilot, too," Palmer Eldritch, from within the shape of Miss Gleason, said. "And I was thinking of greeting you when you land, but that's too much too soon." Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is, I think, this is one of the reasons that Philip K. Dick kind of remains relevant. I mean, there's 100 other science fiction writers of his day, but not very few of them are getting talked about in sort of these terms. Even, sort of Frank Herbert was kind of a contemporary, and okay, he's got the big blow up of the Dune films, and a lot of people really love them, but it still hasn't somehow, like the Dune stuff, other than the concept of Butlerian jihad, hasn't sort of seeped into the sort of philosophical perspective of people, whereas Philip K. Dick seems to be like this touchstone for people who are paying attention to the progress of technology. And it's, the whole idea of the sort of subjective reality, or are we living in the thing that's real, that's simulacra? I mean, we all moved online. This is something that just happened in the last couple of years. We all moved online. That's been a process that's been occurring. And then suddenly it became everything is now fakeable, right? With the advent of AI. So it's like we moved into this world that was like tenuously real. And then suddenly all of the authentication processes that may have worked 10 years ago are like no longer valid. So every day now, it started out that, you'd occasionally see something and it was obviously fake. And now every couple of days I scroll on something, I look at it and I go, is that real? And I don't know. And I just
and it's only going to get more like that. Like that's the direction of travel. I can't remember which critic of Phil Dick said, "It's Phil Dick's world. We just live in it." But I think that becomes actually like more true with each passing year.
Right.
Not because necessarily he was, I guess, like there's a lot of weight put on science fiction being prescient or predicting things. With hard SF, the idea is, if you've got like a good scientific background, you could predict things like, space travel, and did it hit the timeline correctly? With Dick, it's the psychological stuff. It's the experience of these characters living in these worlds where it becomes increasingly difficult to tell reality from, whatever strange variation of reality is emerging or coming out of reality as it breaks down. And these themes recur again and again in his work. I think he's got a lot to say about mental health as well. His characters are often sort of paranoid or very nervous. So I think, they remain relatable because they're flawed protagonists,
Yes. Yeah. And that's one thing that's kind of interesting. Sometimes when you see a Philip K. Dick adaptation into film, sometimes that aspect of his protagonists gets kind of washed away, and they become sort of like standard normal people.
Yeah.
But you go into the book, they're screwed up in very relatable ways. Like, they're not evil, they're not good necessarily either. They're just kind of people. Barney Mayerson is that kind of figure in Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. He's not really a good guy. He's definitely done regrettable things that most people would frown upon, but he's not a villain either. He's sort of just kind of trying to navigate this insane world that he lives in, which makes him which definitely makes him more relatable than simply a hard-ass science fiction space opera hero might be, who's virtuous in all cases, or something like that.
He was really amazing at writing neurotic characters, and that was probably because he was a little bit of a neurotic guy himself. But it's funny, like, in terms of the predictive power of his work, other writing more contemporary to us, like cyberpunk, for instance, is still relevant in terms of its themes. But if you read a cyberpunk novel, like, nobody has a mobile phone, right? So that's in a way dates it really badly now. Mm-hmm. But if you read Phil Dick, some stuff that felt completely fantastical to me when I read it as a kid now feels strangely close to reality. I can't remember which book it's in, but there's a scene where the main character has to argue with the doorknob of his apartment, because he's borrowed money off of the doorknob before, and the doorknob is trying to say, well, how do I know you're going to pay me back the 25 cents this time? I can't let you out. Right. And I mean, if you look at like what happened with the Amazon web services outage recently, you had people who'd bought coffee makers, and it couldn't make them coffee because it wasn't connected to the internet. You had people who'd bought like reclining beds, and they were stuck in the upright position. I mean, that is incredibly Phil Dickian. So I think, it very much is Phil Dick's world. And probably as we get further into this territory of not being able to tell the real from the fake, he'll have even more to say about our current reality.
Yeah, I think so. And of the books that deal with, of Philip K. Dick's books that deal in this kind of thematic terrain, to me, and we'll get into this, to me, Three Stigmata is actually sort of the scariest. Yeah. And I want to get there. I want to, but first, before we get too much into the details of Three Stigmata, I just wanted to ask you, I'm always curious about this, your sort of timeline with Philip K. Dick. When did you kind of come across him in your intellectual life, and sort of what did he mean to you at that point?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a pretty cool story, actually. I had a great aunt called Eunice. She was a wonderful person, and she had an attic full of very, very dusty 60s and 70s science fiction paperbacks. And that was everything from cool. Ursula K. Le Guin to Doris Lessing, but also a ton of Philip K. Dick stuff. She actually even had some 60s and 50s magazines. So the short stories were the first things that I encountered. I think she had the first collection of his book, which was it was like the 1970s edition of Beyond Lies the Wub, if I remember correctly. Okay. So it was the short stories I read first, and I absolutely hoovered them up. I'd harbored ambitions of being a fiction writer, and I used to write short stories when I was a little kid. And it was the way that he wrote things as a just like a what if premise. So he'd come in with a wild premise, and then quite often the end would be strangely foreshortened. He would give you the premise and the characters, and then it would be done. And that goes back to the point about the adaptations, I think. It's not just the slightly neurotic characters that get elided in some of these adaptations, so that they make him, the action star, the kind of man of action. It's also the endings. They nearly always tack on an ending to Philip K. Dick movies. Whether you're talking about Blade Runner, Total Recall, Paycheck, Minority Report. In a movie, there has to be a sense of narrative closure. And in a Philip K. Dick short story, that's not what he does. He leaves you hanging at the end. So I think in a way, some of the best Philip K. Dick adaptations have ended up being ones that weren't adaptations of his work. I think Southland Tales is probably a really good example. Maybe Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, I think, is a very Phil Dickian film.
Yes.
So that's actually the opening chapter of the book, is talking about Phil Dick adaptations and sort of why they failed and which are the ones that are better than actual adaptations. They always change something. I think Netflix are working on a version of one of his novels right now, and they're adapting everything except the aliens. It's like, just adapt the book, you know, adapt the story.
Right. Well, you can sort of understand the sense, because in Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, you actually have a bunch of science fiction premises that, and this isn't necessarily a criticism, just an observation, but it almost feels like you could take any one of them out and the book would still sort of work. Like, if Barney Mayerson wasn't precognitive, I think the book could still work. There'd be some changes, obviously, but I think it would still fundamentally be the same book. And the climate stuff, if it wasn't 150 degrees out, I think the book still fundamentally works. So there's you do get a sense that he just kind of threw a lot of concepts in there. He tied them together, but they don't necessarily need to be there. And that's fine, but as you were talking about, them trying to end the movies and having to tack one on, there's an element where, all right, I'm trying to get this book down into a 90-minute run. Yeah, let's just take this part out. It just gets confusing and it doesn't tie it together or whatever. So I kind of understand
is to do with like how he wrote them as well, right? Because he took a lot of amphetamines, particularly in the kind of middle period of his life when he was writing Three Stigmata, Clans of the Alphane Moon, and other stuff like that. He was, his routine was working while taking amphetamines. So, maybe that accounts for some of the crazy amount of concepts he throws at the page. There's one scene in Three Stigmata which I find really haunting, and I do wonder why it's in there. It's the scene with this psychic jackal on Mars.
Yes.
And Mayerson is sitting on this giant kind of space tractor trying to get it started, and the engines died. And one of the Martian psychic jackals, who he's mentioned previously but completely not expanded upon, sees him and starts sort of like projecting into his mind, like, get down off of the machine so I can eat you. And and then it obviously touches his mind, and it finds Eldritch in there, and it says, no, you're unclean. I mean, that's a really creepy fucking scene.
It is.
But also, you could take the psychic jackals out and it would still stand. So.
It'd still work. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff like that in here, and it's part of what gives it a kind of a rich texture. You never really do know where it's going. And this was the second time I read it, and there were. Not that I remember every detail of every book I read, but there were definitely sections where I was like, oh yeah, I forgot that this. We go way off into left field here, and then we come back. For instance, one of them for me was he has a thing in there where if you live on Mars, you can buy these. I don't remember what they call them, but you can buy some kind of piece of technology, and it animates a book for you, and you can tell it, okay, we want to do Moby Dick, and we want it to be shorter and funny. And we want the animation to be in the style of Picasso, and it just generates it. And I mean, the first time I read that, LLMs and that kind of thing didn't exist. And so now now you read it in this context now, and you're like,
there's
not
loads
exactly
of
the
stuff like
same.
That. Yeah, there's loads of stuff like that. That struck me this time as well, because again, the last time I read it would have been before the era of LLMs and prompts, and it's just weirdly, uncannily accurate to what we're in today. I mean, I think Dr. Smile, who's the kind of therapist in a briefcase that emerges, he crops up early on in the novel. It's another invention that sort of seems more real now than it used to. We have AI therapists who tell people to injure or kill themselves.
Right.
Dr. Smile is basically a Freudian analyst designed to send you crazier so that you can skip the draft and, avoid becoming a Martian colonist. I mean, all of these, they're wacky and they're offbeat, but it kind of shows you how wacky and offbeat and surreal our world has become now. So I think this is part of his enduring relevance for sure. I mean, the climate collapse aspect too, it's so hot that people live in these climate controlled apartments, but the classic PKD way, it's also a metaphor for social class. Like the lower your apartment number, the better the protection you have from the elements. And, again, it's like there's quite often that political aspect to some of the wackier concepts that he's unpacking as well.
Right. Yeah. I got thinking too, in the book, the sort of biggest punishment. So for people who maybe aren't as familiar with the book, one aspect of the world of Three Stigmata is that humans of Earth are colonizing other planets in the solar system, moons, and in particular Mars, and nobody wants to go. So the only way to really end up there is to be drafted. And some people sort of go to great lengths to avoid the draft, and other people kind of go along with it, or they have ulterior motives. But you get thinking about this, and it's like, okay, you go to Mars. Barney Mayerson ends up in Mars, and he's with this group of people, and he's got a job, and the conditions aren't great. But then you think back, like, well, on Earth, it's 150 degrees out. You can't go outside. Is it really that much worse to be on the colony than it is to be, I really got thinking about, like, what that suggestion is there. It is, I suppose, better on Earth because you've got a little bit more freedom, but it's still a very constricted environment. You go outside for 3 minutes and you're going to die. So, and you're heavily reliant on technology to keep you alive. It's just kind of an interesting little twist there. So you had this experience reading all this PKD stuff in was it your aunt, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. Where do you think, I don't expect you to remember exactly what you read in what order, but Three Stigmata, like, how do you sort of rank it amongst PKD novels? And maybe do you remember where it came in? Was it the first book you read? Was it the most recent?
I mean, I was obsessed with the short stories when I was a kid, and I don't actually think that I read any of the novels until I was in my 20s, which actually works quite well because the short stories are so accessible. They're written for a mass market. They have some crazy stuff in them, and he's often trying out concepts he'll revisit in the novels. But then when you reach the novels, that this is a writer who's now reaching for more ambitious kind of territory. And for me, I think, the best of his novels are probably Three Stigmata, Ubik, Martian Time Slip, and Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said. Those are my four favorites. And I think they all kind of come in that mid-period. I think that's when he sort of like really hit his stride. It was after he'd written Man in the High Castle, which obviously won, I think, the Hugo Award, and kind of brought him to
breakout, kind of.
Yeah, kind of brought him to a much wider audience. And it was almost, I think, there's a sense in those novels that he is allowing himself to be more expansive, allowing himself to go for themes that are not necessarily aimed at a mass market, but are aimed at him trying to express something quite deep and strange. And in particular, this book, it contains a lot of the seeds that would later go on to be explored in the exegesis, like the Gnostic Christianity, the idea of a world created by an evil demiurge. And I think Phil himself also talked a lot about how this was a book that was sort of about the idea of the father thing, which is the name of one of his earlier short stories. In the father thing, there's this divided concept of the father as like completely evil or completely good. And I think, you've got the figure of Barney Mayerson in there, who's Leo Bolero, who's the guy who owns the Perky Pat Layouts company. And he's kind of like the benevolent father. He's quite brusque. He's quite kind of like standoffish in some ways, but he's likable and he's humane. And then you have Eldritch, who's the all-powerful sort of evil deity. So I think you can see in Palmer Eldritch, in Three Stigmata, some of the themes that were some of his main obsessions for years and years after. And I think, by the time you get into the exegesis, his mental health was declining. He'd experienced some things which you could describe as a breakdown or a psychotic break, perhaps. And even though the exegesis is incredibly, it's an incredible work of study. Like, he read crazy amounts of stuff to come up with this system. It's maybe even better expressed in Three Stigmata. And I think, I've got some quotes here. He actually said that he hated this book, and he said it several times. He said that it was too full of horror for him, and that when he got the galleys back, he couldn't bear to read it. He said, "I'm afraid of the book. I couldn't bear to read the text." And I think that's really interesting, that he'd conjured something from his mind that actually scared him, that actually was unpleasant for him to experience. He'd gotten almost like too close to some of these deep themes. The horror and fear expressed in the novel are not fictional statements ground out to interest the reader, he said. They come from the deepest part of me, yearning for the good father and fear of the evil father, the father who left me. So I think in a way, like, that's why Three Stigmata sticks with me, is it's clear that it was quite a personal book. It's in some sense autobiographical, and yet it was so unpleasant for him that he would claim he never read it again, which I think is really interesting.
Right. Yeah. Now if I'm remembering sort of his timeline, this is obviously, book was written well before the events of 2374. Which is,
right. Yeah.
For people who are familiar, this was, his nervous breakdown or psychotic break, or the moment when prophetic vision really poured into him, depending on your interpretation of these things, and he had experiences which he deemed to be, I guess, precognitive in a way, but this is almost a decade before, but he'd still had experiences at that time. And I think one of them that really inspired Three Stigmata was, at the time he was working in he had like a little writing shack that he would walk to from his house and back, and he started feeling or seeing this godlike face / presence above him in the sky, and that was the sort of direct inspiration for Palmer Eldritch, and he took the character of Palmer Eldritch in some different directions, but it was really just a sort of a deepening and reifying of this thing he was feeling in the sky. And that is, to me, like one of the most unsettling things into this book. So at some point you get characters plugged into the Chu-Z experience, which is the drug that Palmer Eldritch has brought back. And there's a moment where you realize upon reading it that I think we start with Leo Bolero's experience of Chu-Z, and he has these, on one level it's that's this hallucination, and it can kind of be dismissed, but whenever he tries to escape it, Palmer Eldritch is sort of right there. And there's a moment in there where you realize, like, oh, maybe this whole book, like everything that has happened so far, is taking place inside this Palmer Eldritch controlled hallucination. And then, of course, the next question, or the next sort of implication of that is like, oh, maybe that's what life itself is like, is we're all sort of trapped in this hallucinatory labyrinth that's controlled by the demiurge. And that's what gets like unsettling. That's the part that observation, I think, is along the lines of what PKD himself was scared about in the book, because it's not only that you're in a sort of carefully delimited realm, but there's no escaping from it. It's the very fabric of the thing you're in itself. You can't get out. And then there's even the implication that maybe when you die, you don't even get out. Right. So there's like it's a completely controlled environment. And then you're at the whim of the personality of whatever thing has made this world for you. It is unsettling for sure.
Yeah. I mean, Phil considered himself a Christian, and I think like this is perhaps why the book was so disturbing to him. This is the idea of, well, what if God was real but he was evil? Right. And that's the various characters in the book do question whether or not Palmer Eldritch is a god. And there's some question of, I think, like whether or not he's met God in the void between Proxima and Earth, and what that means. Right. And but then, if you're talking about that vision that he had of the face in the sky, he said a couple of interesting things about that, which Lawrence Sutin quotes in the biography Divine Invasions. First of all, the description of it really does sound like what he was trying to describe was with Palmer Eldritch was the thing he saw. He says it had empty slots for eyes. It was metal and cruel, and worst of all, it was God. You know.
Oof.
And what
That
Sutton says, he connects that to a story that Phil told about his dad scaring him as a kid by putting on his World War II gas mask. And Phil actually said, you know, that maybe that was what he was seeing in the sky, was this memory of his father as a cold, kind of impersonal, metal-faced thing. So I think even on that level of the symbolism of the stigmata themselves, the metal hand, the slotted eyes, it's very tied up with this idea of God the Father, but also his father. So yeah, it's one of the most fascinating chapters of the biography, is where Sutton tries to dig into what exactly the fuck Palmer Eldritch is supposed to be, you know.
Right. From the ship stepped Palmer Eldritch. No one could fail to identify him. Since his crash on Pluto, the homeopapes had printed one pic after another. Of course, the pics were 10 years out of date, but this was still the man. Gray and bony, well over 6 feet tall, with swinging arms and a peculiar, rapid gait. And his face, it had a ravaged quality, eaten away, as if, Barney conjectured, the fat layer had been consumed, as if Eldritch at some time or other had fed off himself, devoured perhaps with gusto the superfluous portions of his own body. He had enormous steel teeth, these having been installed prior to his trip to Prox by Czech dental surgeons. They were welded to his jaws, were permanent. He would die with them. And his right arm was artificial. 20 years ago, in a hunting accident on Callisto, he had lost the original. This one, of course, was superior in that it provided a specialized variety of interchangeable hands. At the moment, Eldritch made use of the 5-finger humanoid manual extremity. Except for its metallic shine, it might have been organic. And he was blind, at least from the standpoint of the natural-born body, but replacements had been made. At the prices which Eldritch could and would pay, that had been done just prior to his Prox voyage by Brazilian oculists. They had done a superb job. The replacements, fitted into the bone sockets, had no pupils, nor did any ball move by muscular action. Instead, a panoramic vision was supplied by a wide-angle lens, a permanent horizontal slot running from edge to edge. The accident to his original eyes had been no accident, a deliberate acid-throwing attack by persons unknown, for equally unknown reasons, at least as far as the public was concerned. Eldritch probably knew. He had, however, said nothing, filed no complaint. Instead, he had gone straight to his team of Brazilian oculists. His horizontally slotted artificial eyes seemed to please him. Almost at once he had appeared at the dedication ceremonies of the new St. George Opera House in Utah, and had mixed with his near peers without embarrassment. Even now, a decade later, the operation was rare, and it was the first time Barney had ever seen the Jensen wide-angle Luxvid eyes. This and the artificial arm with its enormously variable manual repertory impressed him more than he would have expected. Or was there something else about Eldritch? So, I mean, one of the questions I want to talk about or think about is whether the internet is more like Can-D or Choosy. And we'll get there, but like another part of this that gets me thinking about is like Palmer Eldritch. If you consider Palmer Eldritch as a god or some version of a god, you know, when we talk usually about, say, godlike powers, we usually mean something like nuclear weapons, right? The power to destroy the planet. We think of that as being like a godlike power. Or the ability to bring something back to life would be, I think, what we might consider a godlike power. Or to significantly change some creature's attributes, right? To manipulate like genetic information. We might think of that as a godlike power. But what this suggested to me is that the ability, if you can manipulate someone's perceptual reality enough, that in itself is a godlike power. And then as I think, you know, about this, all of us coming online, you know, being in the internet, and now those experiences are even the capability for you being manipulated online is just increasing more and more and more as the algorithms get more sophisticated, as they incorporate more personalized data into them, as the ability to make content, you know, high resolution video content that's totally fake comes on. You start to realize like, well, there is this sort of godlike power happening in the internet. And I think it might be evil, or at least amoral, which in a way might be almost as bad. I guess, to kind of set things up, I want to make sure people who haven't read it have some context here. The two drugs that are of key plot significance in Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, the first is CAN-D, and CAN-D allows you to, if you and a couple of your friends in the same room take it at the same time, you get plugged into, your consciousness gets plugged into this Perky Pat layout. And Perky Pat comes from an earlier story of Philip K. Dick. Perky Pat is essentially Barbie. And you can become Barbie, or you can become her boyfriend, who I think his name is Walt. And if multiple people are with you and you go in together, all the women will go into Perky Pat's head and all the men will go into Walt's head. And your experience is somewhat limited by the products that you have bought to expand and elaborate on your Perky Pat layout. But you're conscripted to that layout. Like, that's where your experience is going to happen, is in this place. So you're going to live the life of Perky Pat, or you're going to live the life of Walt. You're going to go to the beach, and you're going to drive with a convertible top down and all this stuff. And you can see, people living on Mars amongst frozen methane and trying to start old tractors and stuff, why this might be appealing. But then Chu-Z comes along. Chu-Z is this derived from a lichen, some kind of lichen from outside of the solar system. Palmer Eldritch claims that the Proxers have, used it in their religious orgies, and they've brought it back and refined it, and now it's going to be the competitor. And at first, what it seems to allow you to do is, instead of having an experience limited to the Perky Pat layout, you can have an experience of pretty much anything you can imagine. It's like beyond lucid dreaming. It could be anything in there. But pretty quickly you realize that no matter how sort of baroque and personalized the experience might be able to get, it's always haunted by Palmer Eldritch. He's always there. He's always really the kind of the mind behind any of the characters that might show up, etc. And well, first, I guess let me ask you, do you think it's sensible to think about life on the internet in the context? Is there a way we can see an allegory or analogy between these two drugs and life on the internet? Does that make any sense, or am I just reading too much into it?
It does. I was thinking about this because this is a really good question. I think with CAN-D, the analogy for me that fits more onto this is maybe video games, right? It's worth saying as well that both drugs really depend upon the concept of nostalgia. So yes, with the Perky Pat layouts, the characters talk about how it transports them back to Earth, and they feel like they're living a life not just on Earth, but on Earth before it got hot, on Earth when it was kind of perfect. And it's a very bowdlerized, limited, story-driven version, but it's nonetheless one that they can escape to escape, the drudgery and the boredom of life in the colonies. And I think, there's one point where he says, when translated, because that's what they call the experience of taking the drug and going into the layouts, is translation. One could commit incest, murder, anything, and it remained, from a juridical point of view, a mere fantasy, an impotent wish only. I mean, now, I'm a keen player of video games, and in video games, you commit all sorts of atrocities and unreal violence within a simulated world that's sort of limited. It's a sandbox, but the more real it feels, the more fun it is to play. But if the simulated Perky Pat layout is real for the colonists, and at various points they say that it's become a religion using the Perky Pat layouts, taking Chu-Z or taking CAN-D, it's become a religion. They believe that there's a kind of process of transubstantiation that takes place, so that when you're in Pat, when you're in Walt, you actually are them in a kind of real sense, a religious sense. So, aren't their actions also real? If they're committing these horrible acts, but they believe that they actually are these characters, then aren't their actions also real? I think that's a valid question for us in terms of video games. Video games are basically a simulation. As the simulations we create get more complex, as they become more real, and as we are kind of committing crimes on NPC, non-player characters, will that be real or not? And that goes back to the kind of oldest debate in the book about video games, do they lead to real world violence?
with Choose E, it's a little bit different because what it sort of promises to give you is the ability to go back into your past and relive parts of it until you get it right. And I think, this to me is something that, again, is another idea. I can see that why that would scare Phil. Like, Phil is a man who was married several times. It certainly seems from reading his biography like he was quite, he had a wandering eye. He was quite easily would meet a new person, fall in love, go off with them, and then regret it. So the idea of Bolero or Mayerson rather trying to go back into his past until he gets it right with his first wife, that's tremendously sad. And like that, I think, is more like the internet and less like video games. Like with the internet, when you're creating an avatar of yourself to interact online, you're kind of creating like a best version of yourself. You're trying to portray yourself as you would like to be seen. And this is why disagreements online kind of go thermonuclear, right? Because somebody isn't attacking you, they're attacking the perfect version of you, like the version of you that you've curated, the version of you that you've got right. And so you take it a lot more personally. So I think, that's the danger of a fantasy of the order of Choose E, is that it's so solipsistic. And then he twists that because, as you say, within Choose E, you're actually, Palmer Eldritch is the person who is controlling it. He is ever present in it. He can enter anybody's, psychic world who's taken the drug and manipulate it. And then towards the end of the book, what you see is reality within Choose E world breaking down, and everyone is becoming more and more like Palmer Eldritch. So I think, that tells us that like this attempt to go back into your memories and recover a better version of yourself actually leads to the kind of homogeneity of self that Eldritch represents. Like towards the end of the book, he says, I want to take over a planet. What he means is he wants to be everyone on that planet. There's similar themes unpacked in the new Vince Gilligan show, Pluribus. I don't know if you've managed to see the first couple of episodes.
No.
I don't want to give you too many spoilers, but effectively everyone on the planet is a single organism and they're happy, except for a handful of people, one of whom is very not happy about this. And she's curmudgeonly and difficult, and she wants to retain that. She's horrified by the idea of everyone being all in together. I think at one point she says to another character who's still awake, she says, that's not your son. Or it is your son, but it's also your gynecologist. How do you feel about that? So, I mean, it's played for laughs, but it's also a deeply horrifying concept. And it appears in other science fiction books as well, this idea of like a global mind or a single organism that is all of humanity. We are terrified of losing ourselves. And I think by putting too much faith in these avatars that we create online, we do lose ourselves. We lose our authentic self. I've just managed to crowbar myself off social media just a few weeks ago. I mean, arguably Substack's still social media, so I'm not doing that well. But not applying the pressure to myself to sort of visually curate, to sort of like present the impression of a busy writer who's doing important things. Taking the pressure off myself to perform that has left me more able to do it.
To actually do it, right?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a lesson there. So I think, I'm gonna read a Baudrillard quote here again.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
He says in Simulacra and Simulation, today abstraction is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror, or the concept. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or substance. It's the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyper-real. The territory no longer precedes the map, nor does it survive it. It's nevertheless the map that precedes the territory, procession of simulacra that engenders the territory. And I think that's quite a good description of the Choose E world. He's saying that once you have become so fixated on the hyper-real, on the simulacrum, you lose sight of what came first. You essentially give yourself over to being a Palmer Eldritch rather than being a person,
Right. Yeah, it's really this makes me have some sort of questions about human nature. So it's like you talk about this show Pluribus, and thinking about the sort of possible alternate realities you can go into with Choosy or whatever. And in Palmer Eldritch, in the case of Palmer Eldritch, PKD is kind of showing us that, entering that world, it ultimately is corrupted at some deep level, and it's going to kind of fall apart or whatever. But so my reaction to, say, for the Pluribus situation is like, I don't want to be part of a hive, de-individualized and part of a hive, even though I might be happier than I am, right? And I also don't want to live in the quote unquote fake world of Choosy or at least on a permanent basis, any other substance. I want to live in the quote unquote real world, even though it sucks sometimes. And I kind of wonder, like, is that, one hand, I'm sort of like, well, why is that, right? I feel it so deeply, and yet I'm trying to ask myself the question, like, well, if I'd be happier, what's wrong? What's sort of wrong with it in a way, right? Even though I can't get myself over to the thinking that it's a good thing, I almost have questions about that fundamental aspect. And then, yeah, I suppose. But then it also calls into questions like, well, on one level, we are kind of living in a fake world, even in this sort of perceptual reality. I mean, you get into, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Donald Hoffman at all. Yeah, he sort of basically talks about how our sort of perceptual system, and, he's not the first person to make this, but he's maybe the first person to put it in sort of statistical and mathematical terms. I mean, his point is that there's no reason to suppose that your sensory system evolved to see what's actually there or experience what's actually there. Instead, it's evolved to create an experience for your sort of conscious mind that you have the best odds of surviving. So there's no reason to think that what you're seeing is actually there in the way you're seeing it. Rather, you're seeing a sort of carefully filtered screen that will allow your physical body to survive. So in a way, you're living in like a you're living in a augmented or fabricated reality anyway. So, and this is the kind of stuff, the ideas that Philip K. Dick is so good at sort of, forcing the curious reader to end up in. And then he starts, why don't I want to be I'm scared of going into Choosy land, but am I already in some kind of Choosy land, and I just don't know it, right? I'm in the cave, I'm looking at the shadows on the wall, and I don't want to leave the cave because this is what I think is real. This is one of the sort of most fascinating things about Three Stigmata and Philip K. Dick's work in general. The other thing is that kind of thinking. I mean, I'm pretty familiar with Philip K. Dick's biography, and a couple of years ago when I was doing Art of Darkness, we did an in-depth episode on his life. Excuse me. I mean, this kind of thinking is also, excuse me, I suppose it's a chicken or an egg scenario, but this kind of thinking is at least attendant on him losing his mind as well. So there is, I think, one of the things that I like about Three Stigmata so much is it's kind of an info hazard as a book. If you really, if you lock yourself alone in a room and all you have is Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and you stay there for a month and then you leave, you might have some real questions about what's actually real around you, who's in control of it, right? And yeah, anyway, there's not really a question in there.
No, I mean, I think what you're talking about in terms of like the subjectivity that we have as individuals, and can you tell that someone else's reality is the same as your reality, that you inhabit some sort of shared reality. In a way, that's what's consoling about Candide, right? Is that all the women are in Perky Pat, all the men are in Walt. There's a very limited sandbox that you can play in. I mean, for a lot of people, that would be very reassuring because as human beings, we live in a world where you have to read the cues to understand if you're like operating on the same level, having the same conversation as the person next to you. And I think, Dick said that was one of the things that kind of started him off writing, was considering whether the reality of somebody who is psychotic or autistic why is that considered less valid or aberrant? Like, isn't it as real as the reality that somebody who's not got one of those conditions or you know, lives that way experiences? And he would return to that again and again and again. And I think by the time of the exegesis, that starts coming out in a religious way. But you can absolutely see the seeds of all of that in Three Stigmata. I think, like, you know, he talks,
and even earlier.
Yeah, there's a fascinating speech that the character Richard Hanat makes when he goes for the E-therapy. So this is another wild concept that Dick chucks in, is the idea that you can accelerate your evolution and your brain space by taking this strange therapy, but it makes your head grow. So they call them, I think, bubble heads. And you get like a weird rind on your head. So, you know, this is all very strange, but he starts talking about the tomb world when he's in the E-therapy chamber. And he talks about the different layers of reality. And this is fascinating because layers of reality are what the book is going to go on to explore. And he says that the median layer is the human layer, but at any instant, a man could plunge into the hell layer beneath. And simultaneously, he could ascend to the ethereal world above, but always in the middle level of the human, a man risked sinking. And yet the possibility of ascent lay before him. So he's saying that you could go into the hell realm or the heaven realm at any point. And then he says, and I think this is really telling, depression, all mental illness was the sinking, but the other, how was it achieved? Through empathy. And empathy is another theme that just occurs again and again in Dick's work, whether it's empathy with other living creatures, like you get a little bit of in androids, whether it's empathy between human beings, like that was kind of his highest virtue. And by the time he's getting into the Gnostic vision stuff with Valis and exegesis, he starts talking about the hell layer as what he called the black iron prison. And the black iron prison is kind of like the reality that we inhabit that is the false reality. So he thinks that, you know, by that point in his career, he's saying we've sunk into the hell realm as a society. But he was also optimistic that we could get out of it. Like he talks about Nixon's police state, and it is kind of symbolic of every police state. But it's also depression and unhappiness. But he believed we could beat it. So, you know, empathy is like the most Christian of virtues. It was the virtue he admired the most. And it's a way to transcend to the heaven realm, but it's also incredibly difficult to practice because, like his characters, we're venal, we're flawed, you know, we're selfish. So I think there's a lot there that just sort of reveals how his Christianity functions, how he treats original sin. I think, you know, Mayerson at one point says, it takes a certain amount of courage to face yourself and say with candor, I'm rotten, I've done evil, and I will again. It was no accident. It emanated from the true, authentic me. And that's a really brutal thing for the hero to say, you know?
Right. Right.
So yeah, there's
and it's something we could all say if we were sort of courageous enough to let our mind go there, right?
But certainly, you know, as somebody who's struggled with depression, you know, I'm diagnosed bipolar. I experience mood swings, and sometimes those can be very violent and sudden. I think that idea that you can descend into the hell realm at any point is really, really bang on the money. And I think that's the difficult other half of it, is that the way out of it is not necessarily about finding things within yourself. It's about finding things out with yourself. And that is the mission, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, this concept of empathy, I hadn't really thought about it a whole lot in terms of Philip K. Dick's work, but you're right. And I mean, I get thinking about, you've set up this sort of paradigm for me of the video game and the internet as being these. And I really do like to think about these as places we sort of inhabit, right? And because they functionally are. Video games, I guess if you don't play video games, you're not in that realm so much. But most of us are on the internet, unless we've like deliberately, anybody listening to this sort of lives on the internet to some degree. And I do kind of wonder, you know, if empathy is one of the sort of doorways out of the hell realm, is the internet, the way people communicate with each other, the way the algorithm feeds us, I sort of have my own answer to this question, but is it promoting, is living on the internet making it harder to be empathetic or easier to be empathetic? I mean, I don't know what you think about that. What effect does it have on us in that sense? Living in the choosy world of social media or whatever.
I think it's making it harder. And I think it's partly to do with that hardening, that I was talking about when you're so deeply invested in this avatar that you've created that you harden it up. But, like what we're talking about here is the idea of like self and other, and I think the internet is doing strange things to how we think about the self and how we think about the other. I think our concept of the other is positively affected by being embedded in communities, and anything that's taking us away from that, or indeed giving us a simulated version of it, like, I'm part of the community on Reddit. I'm part of the neurodivergent community. Are you part of a community? Like a community used to mean like a neighborhood or people who met in real life. I think our notions of community and of belonging are being seriously undermined by the internet. And this is another thing that he explores, right, in Three Stigmata. It's a book about an alien invasion, even if that alien that's spearheading it is a human being or used to be a human being.
Used to be, yeah.
But, very early on in the book, when somebody describes the Proxers, the people from Proxima, they are described as things, right? They're also described as human. He talks about the humanoid council of the Proxers. But one of the characters expresses real disgust. She says, I hate those things, And yet, so it's almost like they've decided that the Proxers can't be part of their community, that we're not part of some global community of conscious beings. We're human and they are things, right? But then at the same time, Perky Pat layouts, they're already monetizing the other, right? They fear invasion from Prox and from Eldritch, but they already exploit and invade other planets. There's a really funny bit where he talks about, have you finished your Proximan Wop Frog croquette yet? Or he talks about like a tie that's grown in cultures from a primitive life form on another planet. Yeah. So they're already, by seeing things that are non-human as other, they're also therefore exploitable. Is there really that much difference? Is Eldritch really seeing, humanity as anything other than a commodity, as something to be consumed, something to be treated as other and therefore property? So I think it's really interesting there, that fear of invasion, that fear of the other, but also that ability to therefore like reify it into a thing so it can be consumed or rejected. These are all really fascinating things, and I think that's the issue on in the internet culture, right? Is it's very easy to other someone, especially if you're just reacting through the medium of text, or you're like watching a clip where they're presenting themselves a certain way. You can very easily other that person. You can say, oh, they're this type of person, they're that type of person. I've seen that type before. You've reified them into a thing, right?
Yeah, and you end up having a bunch of, and we all do this, you end up having a whole, like, not only make an assumption about them, but you make a whole chain of assumptions. You end up making a whole chain of assumptions about them that like build themselves up into this, into a figure that isn't what they actually are. Yeah. That's and then to realize that that's also kind of happening to you if you're active and on the internet and have some level of presence, even if that's just sending out a tweet occasionally. It gets kind of fascinating. In one hand, as sort of time goes on, you do start to wonder, okay, I'm totally with you with this idea of like, for the most part, when you're on the internet, you're not actually in a community. You may have, I know a bunch of people on the internet now. I know a bunch of people that I've never met in person, including yourself.
Yeah, we met on the internet, exactly.
Yeah, we met on the internet, right? And you know, and there's a bunch of, if I, you know, you and I aren't best friends. I don't know that much about you, but we get along just fine. And if I send you a message, you'll reply back at some point, you know, in fairly short order, and it'll be all friendly and congenial. So you get a bunch of relationships like that, and it does feel like you're a community. There's a way in which you can, and I've sort of noticed this in myself, where as that develops, you sort of start leaving your physical real world community. I don't want to say leaving it behind, but it starts to kind of fade away a little bit.
And part of that's to do because, like, when you're on the internet, you're connecting directly with people with the same specialized interests as you.
Yes.
Like the first, and for me, the greatest era of the internet was the forum era. Because when you're going on a forum, like a comic book forum, in my case, you're meeting a bunch of other people who are into comics. And so you've created a simulation of community in your head. Like, you are part of a community. Those people are all real, but there's no physical proximity. You are only seeing aspects of them that they're choosing to kind of reveal. So, you know, this goes back to the Baudrillard quote, right? It's very easy to mistake the map for the territory on the internet. And I had the experience of, like, first of all, a forum that I was part of descended into acrimony and collapsed. So suddenly, like, it was like the stage set dissolved, you know, a bit like Ubik, with everything just crumbling. Second of all, Facebook started, they launched the groups feature, and groups were very much meant to mimic forums. The idea was that you would have a forum, but it would be on Facebook and it would be part of a group. And a lot of people migrated into groups and abandoned the forums. But then the groups started to be, you know, to use Cory Doctorow's term, enshittified, you know? So they were full of promotion or adverts or self-promotion. And so they were already like a more rubbish simulation of a community than the forums had been. But you can't get the forums back. Like, you can't go back to that, you know? Right. So it's really interesting as well in terms of being part of Substack. Substack can feel like that, like a community of engaged individuals, people with quite diverse interests, but with whom you can interact. There's no ads on the site. But will it stay like that forever? Like, all of these things are time limited, and I think it's really incumbent upon people who are on the internet and trying to put themselves across, whether to make work of one kind or another or just to connect, is that what you are doing there is you are kind of taking the choosee and you are going into a simulation. And I think as long as you remember that unless you're physically with a person, you know, maybe you could make the argument that a conversation like this, because it's two individuals over camera, is more like a phone conversation. It's an actual conversation. Yeah. But when you're interacting through a medium, whether that's a drug or a keyboard, you are entering a simulation. It is not real. It's a sandbox. It has certain rules. And I think the people who become unwell through overly fixating on internet communities, and I put myself in that category, it's because they mistake the map for the territory, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an element too where, well, I like this idea of the keeping in mind that you're going into a simulated reality. I think there's also something about, there is sort of shades of community, and sure, you know, just being in a group where everybody's into, you know, subject X doesn't quite make you that. But you're right. I think having a conversation like this is something closer to community, even because an element of your real community that you live out in, there's a certain degree of interdependence between people that only survives on a certain degree of trust. This doesn't necessarily mean you trust everybody with your life, but that you like you and I, we set a time and we both basically trusted that that's when it was going to happen. And if it wasn't when it was going to happen, one of us was going to reach out to the other and kind of keep it all going, right? So there is kind of shades of that. And I think if you are sort of hungry for community on the internet, one thing to kind of think about is that you might have to go a notch beyond just whatever your sort of niche interest is. You might have to look for ways to cultivate and develop some degree of interdependence and collaboration in some way. I think that can kind of help that sort of denaturing experience. But the other thing I got thinking about as you were talking is, the Perky Pat thing. I didn't even really think about this as I was reading, but something you said kind of called it to mind. This idea that you're going to take Candy, and if you're a male, you go into Walt, and if you're a female, you go into Pat. And there's a whole lot of sort of gender stuff you can get into with that. But what's more interesting to me about that is thinking about how online sort of discourse generally tends to like fall into these left-right categories that have become so amorphous and murky that like I'm not even sure what they mean exactly anymore. And then I think what ends up happening for a lot of people is they sort of feel like they've got to split cleanly to one or the other, and then this isn't to say one. I'm not trying to even make a political point here, but more about like keeping your individualized psyche alive is sort of like, is there a way in which treating the internet like a Perky Pat layout ends up like spreadsheetifying you, ends up sort of boiling you down and squaring off your round edges and forcing you, or at least it feels like it's forcing you to exist in one thing. And then you get extremely defensive about anything that might be pulling you to it. Even if it's like a good argument from somebody who you perceive as being in the other community, you almost get angrier about that because you can feel the pull of it, right? Yeah, it's interesting.
And I wonder if that's like an emergent property of the fact that like when you're on the internet, you kind of are in Palmer Eldritch's world. Like it's owned by massive corporations, run by individual billionaires with particular agendas. Look at what happened to Twitter under Elon Musk. Suddenly, he changed the nature of that reality. He kicked over the scenery. Most of the people who were kind of progressive, or at least a large amount of them, left for Blue Sky. And you were left with this ecosphere of like very radicalized, quite right-wing people. Suddenly, a lot of the stuff you were seeing was like anti-immigration, anti-trans, anti-gay. It was hard to avoid that stuff. It was like he'd pulled us into the hell world a little bit, to use the terms of the book. And
that did really point out, seeing that transition really did point out, even no matter what side of any of these things you're on, it did really point out how much sort of lever pulling and knob turning there is behind the scenes to create the seemingly kind of spontaneous reality of, say, Twitter or any other social media thing, right? That really kind of it made me think like, oh, maybe something like that's probably happening in all of these things, but you never see the transition happen kind of overnight, so you sort of don't notice it in a way.
Yeah, it's a kind of audience capture, I guess is the term for it. But also I think, this is what I mean by it being an emergent property, is that, when you're on these social media platforms, your value to the corporations who provide the platforms is the data that you produce.
Yes.
And they use that data that you produce to analyze what to sell you next, right? That's the idea. It's predicting human futures. What's this person going to want next? So in order to do that, what it's doing is placing you into boxes, spreadsheetifying you, to use your term. It's trying to categorize all the human types. Like I used to do social media marketing for a living. And one of the things that you would produce when you were setting up a campaign was personas. And those personas would be like, middle-class single mom who cares about her kids, and, or self-starting gym fan guy who's also into Pokemon or whatever. The categorizing of identity into specific rigid boxes is absolutely what the internet is trying to do to you by harvesting your data. So is it surprising that as a result of being subject to that process, your own identity begins to calcify? You are suddenly able to say, I'm going to put myself in this box, and this box. And anyone in those other boxes, fuck them. That's the opposite of us. Like, that's I think what's leading to the polarization, is that we are more than ever before, being considered as subjects to market at. And it was the same, this all goes back to Eddie Bernays and, him using psychological techniques for advertising. It's just been so turbocharged by the internet. And again, in terms of that self-reflexive thing of like it only reflecting back to you the thing it wants you to hear, artificial intelligence is turbocharging that even more. Yes. And that's why you get people experiencing AI psychosis, is that this thing isn't trying to have a conversation with you. This thing is trying to reflect back to you what it thinks you want to hear. It's literally just picking from boxes. So I think we're in very dangerous territory when it comes to the self and the other as a society. Like we've reified the other into things, but we've also kind of reified ourselves into things, into data points. This is why I like Barbie as well in comparison to Three Stigmata. In Barbie, Barbie Land is like a parallel reality as well, right? But in Perky Pat World, it's like a low-res simulation. It's the faith of the colonists that makes it real. They call that translation, transubstantiation. Whereas in reverse, in Barbie, in the movie Barbie and Ken want to become real. They want to transubstantiate from plastic, So I guess in Three Stigmata, you've got this idea of we've put on immortality. We've become transcendent. Whereas in Barbie, they want to be mortal and real. And yet the way that Ken, in particular in that movie, approaches wanting to be mortal and real is to sort of try and incorporate these like weird symbols of macho-ness. Like, he says, okay, being a man is riding a horse and having a cowboy hat. Being a man is driving this particular car. And at the end, the conclusion that he comes to is that he's just Ken, right? So, but that means he's nothing. Like he is what he is. He's a plastic doll denuded of all personality. He's a generic figure into which we can put ourselves. He doesn't even have any genitalia. So in order to sort of not be this kind of like, Bowdlerized, like cliched version of a man, he has to become nothing. I think that's really fascinating. And it's kind of the opposite of what's happening when you're going into Perky Pat World,
Right. Yeah. You just put on the Perky Pat clothes and you drive the Perky Pat car and it's very much well, and it's interesting how sort of nostalgia works into that stuff, right? Like, because nostalgia is operating on a couple sort of different channels. I mean, I will say that one thing I have realized, partially through thinking about Philip K. Dick's work, but also some other things, is being very suspicious when I know that I'm being... When Palmer Eldritch, the Palmer Eldritch behind the internet, is using nostalgia to extract data from me, that seems to be when it's one thing I notice the most, I guess, and I'm sort of the most suspicious of, and I think it's good to kind of be able to start to recognize some of the ways that you can be being manipulated or taken advantage of, but one of the potentially unfortunate side effects for me is I find myself gradually, because I'm so suspicious of nostalgia being presented to me, I find myself gradually pushing myself away from the feeling of nostalgia in general. And this kind of ties into the becoming nothing thing, right? Because now it starts to make you, it starts to make you suspicious of liking the things you liked when you were a child or at different stages in your life, because they feel like attack points for you to be taken advantage of. But in truth, like, I am sort of, at least on one level, a sum of my experiences and preferences and memories, right? So if I can't comfortably revisit some of that stuff, I start to lose a little bit of my identity. which maybe I need to do, but it's a little bit uncomfortable. Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating. I guess my whole point there is thinking about living in this sort of the internet realm. There is this way it's kind of boiling us down and simplifying us and spreadsheetifying us, but it's happening in some kind of difficult. Even the reaction against that, you end up sort of playing into its hands. I guess is my point. Like, if you become the I never go on the internet guy, there's some way in which you're almost playing the internet's game in a way as well.
It's like that Bill Hicks joke. The old anti-marketing shtick, you know.
Right.
That's some good shtick. We could sell a lot of products with that shtick. I think I can't remember which character it is in the book, but he comes up with these two kind of quite clunky terms for Candy and Choosy to sort of delineate them. Candy, the character says, has materialistality, right? So I think what he's saying there is you buy in, you stay brand loyal, you know, but the experience is sort of time limited. You know it's controlled. You're aware it's a simulation, but you sort of believe it's real while you're in there. And then Choosy has unmaterialistality. So the experience there, at least the experience that's promised, is that it's transcendent, that it actually is real. At least until you see Palmer Eldritch. The idea is, or at least the promise is, that you have control of what you can experience and that you can actually change the past. So nostalgia isn't just about echoing or simulating your past, it's about re-experiencing it. So I think this is one of the reasons the book is so scary, is that both sides of that coin are terrifying. You know, and really, you know, again, it goes back to being a quite good description of the challenges we've got navigating the online world and the real world. You know, we do buy in, we do stay brand loyal, we do experience, you know, these time limited, closed worlds. But then we also have the promise of something like Twitter, which certainly when it's set out to be like the public square. It promised to be the real world, like an extension of the real world. It only became apparent that it wasn't the real world when Palmer Eldritch came in and started kicking down the sets, right? So I think, you know, it really does get to the heart of that. I think one of the characters, I think it's Anne Hawthorne, who's the kind of religious character who Mayerson meets when he goes to Mars. He meets her on the space ferry up to Mars. And she asks him, isn't a miserable reality better than the most interesting illusion? And that question is like really quite haunting, right? Because the reality that the colonists live in is miserable. And the reality that we live in many ways is miserable. And it's going to get more miserable with threats like climate change, with increasing political polarization and less political power for individuals. At that point, when does an interesting illusion actually become preferable to a miserable reality? We are approaching that point as the human species. And this is the whole idea of the argument of the simulation argument, you know, put forward by Nick Bostrom. Maybe all societies reach a point where living in a simulated version of living in the present of a simulation that you kind of like plays on your nostalgia, gives you a perfected world. When does that become, you know, perhaps all civilizations, once they have the computing power, set up these simulations. And given that the likelihood is that we will have that computing power, is it possible to tell whether we're already in one of those simulations? That's the basic conceit of it. And I mean, The Matrix also unpacks that as well. You know, The Matrix says at one point in, I think, the first movie, that the 1990s was the high point of human culture. Now, I was born in 1980, so I'm inclined to believe that. Like, I remember what the 90s was like.
Oh yeah, that's when all the music was the best. All the
music
movies were the
was
best.
great. Yeah, you know, and like, so I was part of what I consider to be an authentic community back there, which was the rave community. We would go out to illegal raves. It was very much not like a fashion thing. You know, everybody was just like shaved their heads, was wearing the most breathable fabrics possible. We all went out and we took the same drug, and we had an experience in these, you know, fields and quarries that sort of united us and turned us in, from being individuals into a community, even if it was a time limited one. And then recently I was on a train to Edinburgh at the same time as there was a Taylor Swift concert. And there was all these young kids going to the Taylor Swift concert. She'd asked them on social media to wear, I think, like sequin tops and cowboy hats so that it would look good for the gram when she, put the camera out in front. And I just thought I felt kind of a sadness for these young Swifties that this was the culture that they had available to them at 16, 17, 18, was to buy into a brand that's led by a hero figure that asks you to dress homogeneously, that asks you to take part in a spectacle that's as much about the spectacle being recorded and transmitted to other people as it is to you having the authentic experience. But again, am I just being a curmudgeon? Like, let people be into what they're into. And if they want to dress the same and listen to the same music, like, is that really that different to what I was participating in the 90s? I don't really know. But I do feel like, for me, I feel very blessed that I was able to take part in a ritual and a community that felt like it brought people together, and it happened in the real world, and I didn't have to pay £150 for a ticket or buy 10 versions of the same album on vinyl. I don't know.
And you didn't become part of somebody else's marketing plan necessarily either, right?
Yeah, there was something very anti-marketing and anti-corporate and also anti-culture about rave. I mean, like, we've been rewatching episodes of Top of the Pops. Top of the Pops is like the British chart TV show. And up to about 1997, I know all of the records, I know all of the bands, and I'm like experiencing the nostalgic feels. And then about 1998, I'm like, who the fuck were they? I don't remember this song. And the reason is because I'd started taking ecstasy and going out at the weekends. I didn't give a fuck about what was in the charts or what was being marketed to me. I didn't give a fuck about Britpop, So it's just really interesting. I wonder if people even know that the experiences on offer for them now are inauthentic,
Yeah. I mean, well, this is one of the things, I don't hew too closely to like sort of rigid generational differences, but I do think there was something in you said you were born in 80, I was born in 83, so we're basically the same age, sort of elder millennials. And there was a thing in Gen X, and I am sort of spiritually Gen X, even though I don't quite line up with the time. There was, for all of its potential faults and all the ways you could criticize the individual members and whatever, there was a thing about sort of selling out. There was sort of, it did seem to be that there was this recognition that there were forces at play that were trying to turn you into the Borg, and there was a resistance to it. And maybe sometimes that resistance was also being taken advantage of by the Borg. I'm not saying it was perfect, and look where we are now. But that whole impulse, as I sort of look forward into Gen Z, and I know some of the following generation, Gen Alpha or whatever it's called, I don't see really any of that impulse at all. And I do kind of wonder if that was sort of an immune response that is being sort of lost now. And it'll be interesting to sort of see how that plays out. I do sometimes wonder too, like how that, pushing back against sellout, that particular kind of Gen X authenticity, how that may have been a place you could inhabit because, go ahead.
Sorry, you were breaking up a little bit there, so I thought you'd paused. But I think we're back now.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that the commodification that Generation X at least thought it was resisting, that now is the only culture available, is to participate in your own commodification. Like, to be a Swiftie is to use the hashtags, to buy the gear, to be part of the Eras tour, go to the cinema to see it. The commodification is the culture. So there is no, like, don't be a sellout, because participating in the commodification is the culture itself, I think, like, and this is maybe a vain hope on my part, but I think the next great cultural moment will happen when a generation of kids decides they don't want to be online where they just log off en masse. I think the next punk rock or the next rave or the next hip hop will come out of a generation of people who decide to live in the real world rather than taking part in their own commodification. But then the question is, will that ever happen? Have we gone too far now? And also, was it the Bill Hicks thing for us? Was the, oh, don't be a sellout, was that what they were selling us? It's really hard to tell, isn't it? But I mean,
it is very hard to tell. And certainly on some level they were trying to sell it to us, right? And certainly on some level it was a commercial avenue, you know.
Yeah.
You can definitely. I'm sure there were board meetings in the early '90s that were like, well, how do you sell to these kids? First of all, you can't make it obvious you're trying to sell anything. You have to actually make it anti-selling, right? Like, I'm sure those conversations happened at various companies in big boardrooms with guys in suits. That definitely happened. And yeah, that is interesting. This idea that maybe, you know, there may be cultural sort of movements, generational movements in the future that like log off, and you do wonder. I probably wouldn't know about them. I'm kind of aged out of having my finger on the pulse of anything, to be honest, but. You do wonder, like, I mean, I think the start of that would be like, let's have an event that we don't record, a concert that there aren't photos of, a play that isn't videotaped and has a trailer on YouTube, you know.
Funnily enough, I went to a nightclub in Berlin. It's called Tresor, and we had to queue for a long ass time to get in, but finally we got in. And the first thing that they did was they put like black duct tape over our phone cameras. And within the bounds of this club, I mean, the clubs in Berlin are in these enormous warehouses. So it's like 5 floors, DJs on every floor.
Right.
And it was quite like dark and smoky, and the music was very pounding. But walking around that club and not seeing anyone with their phone out, nobody taking pictures.
Wild.
It was almost, I mean, we talk about nostalgia. That's how it felt in the late 90s. And I was there with a bunch of guys who I used to go party with, you know, back then. We're all in our 40s now. And we were just, I think, like blown away by how transported we were back to an era before the commodification of the self was an ever-present part of any cultural activity you take part in. So I don't know whether people are going to start taping up mobile phone cameras at gigs here in Scotland, but I would be down with that. You know, I would absolutely be down with that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It feels like we're kind of pointing to, you know, I was talking earlier in this conversation about being taken advantage of via nostalgia. But I think what you're kind of outlining is maybe there's a way, as long as you kind of know what's happening and know the limits of it, in which nostalgia might actually be a route out of the hive to a certain extent, right? As long as you're thinking about what were the kind of core values that made it feel that way and trying to lean into those, there might actually be at least temporarily. Yeah, you can step back into the 90s temporarily.
I was very enthusiastic about becoming an online identity. Like, I was passionate in my creation of an avatar. That stuff happened like when I was in my mid-20s. That's when social media was coming online. Forums were big. I was very, very invested in this. So it's not like I'm kind of like exempting myself from this or saying that like I had a super authentic experience as a young person that people now aren't having. It's just that after a long time I realized it was actually damaging me, that it was getting in the way of being in real life. Like, I think you said that as well. Like, you sort of start to, the more into it you become, this online, you know, kind of like status game, the more you do kind of withdraw or discount the, you know, more real, more complicated relationships that you have with people in the real world. So I think it's, you know, it's that's what I mean about a generation that logs off. I think they would have to experience a visceral reaction that made them log off. So I don't know where that's going to come from or whether it'll happen. I won't be a part of it except as a spectator, but I think it would be interesting to see for sure. You know, maybe that is the Butlerian jihad for the next generation. Is log off and no machines, you know.
Right. Well, yeah, I'm here for it. You still try to find a way to listen to this podcast, but other than that, and read Bram's work. But beyond that, you don't need the internet at all. He had scooped perhaps a half-mile of a regular ditch, as yet void of water, when he discovered that an indigenous life form, a Martian something, was stalking him. At once he halted the dredge and peered into the glare of the cold Martian sun to make it out. It looked a little like a lean, famished old grandmother on all fours, and he realized that this was probably the jackal creature which he had been warned repeatedly about. In any case, whatever it was, it obviously hadn't fed in days. It eyed him ravenously while keeping its distance, and then, projected telepathically, its thoughts reached him. So he was right. This was it. "May I eat you?" it asked, and panted, avidly slack-jawed. "Christ, no," Barney said. He fumbled about in the cab of the dredge for something to use as a weapon. His hands closed over a heavy wrench, and he displayed it to the Martian predator, letting it speak for him. There lay a great message in the wrench and the way he gripped it. "Get down off that contraption," the Martian predator thought, in a mixture of hope and need. "I can't reach you up there." The last was intended, certainly, to be a private thought, retained in camera, but somehow it had gotten projected too. The creature had no finesse. "I'll wait," it decided. "He has to get down eventually." Barney swung the dredge around and started it back in the direction of chickenpox prospects. Groaning, it clanked at a maddeningly slow rate. It appeared to be failing with each yard. He had the intuition that it was not going to make it. Maybe the creature's right, he said to himself. It is possible. I'll have to step down and face it. Spared, he thought bitterly, by the enormously higher life form that entered PALMER ELDRITCH, that showed up in our system from out there, and then eaten by this stunted beast. The termination of a long flight, he thought. A final arrival that even 5 minutes ago, despite my precog talent, I didn't anticipate. Maybe I didn't want to, as Dr. Smile, if he were here, would triumphantly bleat. The dredge wheezed, bucked violently, and then painfully contracting itself, curled up. Its life flickered a moment, and then it died to a stop. For a time, Barney sat in silence. Placed directly ahead of him, the old grandmother, jackal, Martian flesh-eater watched, never taking its eyes from him. "All right," Barney said. "Here I come." He hopped from the cab of the dredge, flailing with the wrench. The creature dashed at him. Almost to him, 5 feet away, it suddenly squealed, veered, and ran past, not touching him. He spun and watched it go. "Unclean," it thought to itself. It halted at a safe distance and fearfully regarded him, tongue lolling. "You're an unclean thing," it informed him dismally. Unclean, Barney thought. How? Why? "You just are," the predator answered. "Look at yourself. I can't eat you. I'd be sick." It remained where it was, drooping with disappointment and aversion. He had horrified it. "Maybe we're all unclean to you," Barney said. "All of us from Earth, alien to this world, unfamiliar." "Just you," it told him flatly. "Look at your right arm, your hand. There's something intolerably wrong with you. How can you live with yourself? Can't you cleanse yourself some way?" Barney did not bother to look at his arm and hand. It was unnecessary. Calmly, with all the dignity that he could manage, he walked on over the loosely packed sand toward his hovel. There was another sort of aspect of Philip K. Dick's life in this work here that I wanted to talk about. You know, in being familiar with his biography and reading, I don't know if anybody's read everything by Philip K. Dick, but reading quite a bit, enough of it anyway, you start to think about, so at one point in Philip K. Dick's career, he wanted to be, I think he even used the term, he wanted to be a literary writer. And the science fiction stuff was, at first, it seemed like it was, you know, it was a way that he could get published. There was sort of maybe a lower barrier to entry, if not actual easier route to legitimate success. And through Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch is near, might be a little bit after, but it's near the end of his sort of efforts to even bother trying to be a literary writer. He'd written somewhere between 9 and 12 fictional but more or less realistic novels. Confessions of a Crap Artist is probably the most well-known. I got just sort of thinking about this idea that, you know, he saw on some level working in science fiction, at least at one point in his career, he saw working in science fiction as sort of operating in the ghetto, in this sort of intellectual and artistic ghetto, and that there was a higher realm that he could get into, which was occupied by people like James Joyce and you know, name your Nobel or Pulitzer winner or candidate. And there was disappointment. He had some disappointment that he never really reached that. That Confessions of a Crap Artist is okay, but it's not. It's nobody's gonna. It doesn't operate in that register that the best of quote unquote literary fiction has to offer. I was just curious, kind of your thoughts. Is there really anymore this distinction between literary fiction and, say, science fiction or speculative fiction? Does it matter? Is it the ghetto? Is speculative fiction still the ghetto?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
There's a lot of aspects to that question. I mean, first of all, I'll say like I'm fascinated by the life of Philip K. Dick as much as I am by his fiction. There's two particularly good biographies. I mean, the Divine Invasions by Lawrence Sutin is comprehensive. It unpacks every stage of his life, every era. There's another one which I really, really love. It's actually one of my favorite books. It's called I Am Alive and You Are Dead, A Journey into the Mind of Philip K. Dick. It's by Emmanuel Carrera. And that is... I think I'd read some biographical material about him before I read that, but it's just so powerfully written that you really get a sense of Phil the man and Phil the walking contradiction, right? So I think he was a bundle of contradictions, and I think he was simultaneously an incredibly passionate fan of science fiction, very proud of being a professional science fiction writer, but also longed for like mainstream acceptance. And part of that was to do with money. Like science fiction just didn't pay, even though it was quite big back then. It didn't pay. Right. One of the sad aspects of his life is that he's now one of the most valuable IP farms in Hollywood, and yet he died.
It's like
months.
Stephen King is maybe higher than there's maybe 2 or 3 other people that might have more sort of.
But he's up there.
Yeah, he's right up there.
And he died just before Blade Runner was released. He did get to see a print of it, and he said it was amazing to see his work adapted and that they'd nailed the vibe of his book. He said it was like seeing his world come to life. But he certainly didn't make a lot of money off of the sale of that book for development. He had, Blade Runner itself was not a wild success when it came out. So he's a person who didn't live long enough to see his own success, let alone his own financial success. There's some very sad parts at the end of Carrera's book where Phil has, I think, checked himself into a heroin rehab program simply because it's the only way that he thinks he can afford to get therapy and mental health treatment. Mm-hmm. And he's writing letters to other science fiction writers, begging them to let him come and stay on their couch. And they're telling him no, because it's already known by then that Phil is a little bit loopy, right? Mm-hmm. He had a number of marriages that ended up on the rocks. And I think even when he was writing his best work, he was writing it sometimes in a shack at the back of, his wife's property. He was kind of, it was like a subsistence living that was his experience of being a writer. And that's easy to forget because he's so celebrated now. And I think, his name is now mentioned alongside people like Borges, Baudrillard himself considered Philip K. Dick the best writer of science fiction. So he never really got to see that. And it's important, I think, to remember that when you think about how he self-conceptualized the idea of himself as like a genre writer. But if anything, I think we've gone too far in the other direction. Like if you look at what sells now, a lot of it is just like, it's werewolves, but they're horny. You have genres like dark academia, where it's basically like Donna Tartt's The Secret History, but mixed with Harry Potter. You have writers who come up through fan fiction and then get 7-figure deals. But, 2 of the best works that I read this year were self-published. And they were both from writers that I found on Substack. I think, at least one of these writers only sold a couple of 100 copies. But when you read their stuff, it's got a voice and thematic concerns and kind of just a level of quality that back in the late 90s would have made them writers on a level of a Douglas Copeland or a Bret Easton Ellis. It's just that there's no market for that now. Like nobody reads it, nobody wants it. It's still being written. There's still, great writers out there writing amazing stuff. But genre fiction, particularly, you know, the kind of like fantasy, romance, and amalgams of the two, have become so dominant that they've kind of crowded out a lot of stuff that would have previously been good, what, you know, top selling literature. And a lot of the writers that I think, you know, Phil Dick would have wanted to emulate as a quote unquote mainstream or serious writer are largely forgotten now as well. You know, like he's now more famous and has sold more books than they ever were.
Yes.
So I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, I think like there's an incredible underground literary movement based around autofiction now. You have writers like Tao Lin, who's absolutely amazing, you know, getting quite a lot of kind of mainstream success and attention. But and science fiction's an interesting one in and of itself, in that like what hasn't changed about science fiction is that you can sell thousands and thousands and thousands of books as a science fiction writer. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get any coverage in the mainstream. You could be a wildly successful sci-fi or horror author, and nobody among your normie friends will have heard of you. I mean, the classic version of that in Scotland is Ian Banks. He was incredibly critically acclaimed for novels like The Wasp Factory and The Crow Road, but they never ever wrote about his science fiction novels. They never mentioned the culture. They never interviewed him about the culture, which is the towering achievement of that man's literary life. And the only way that the culture, like I think now, I can't remember if it's Netflix or another network, are adapting Consider Flabas. And if that show's a huge hit, people will suddenly be like, hey, there are loads of these novels. And they might, you know, and they outsold his mainstream novels by several orders of magnitude. Like if you know about the culture novels, you love them and you've got all of them and you devoured each one as it came out. But nobody in the Scottish press was ever like science fiction author Ian Banks, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting.
So I think it's still ghettoized a little bit, you know?
Yeah. And it does seem to be. It does, but yeah, you make a really good point about it, you know, selling tons of copies and then not sort of getting critical response, but you know, the stuff that gets critical response doesn't necessarily sell tons and tons of copies. And so there does seem to be this more obvious, and you see this across sort of mainstream versus subcultural stuff all over the place, where the sort of the cracks between what's sort of institutionally recognized as a legitimate phenomena and what actually sort of makes money are sort of like breaking down even more, and across multiple spectrums. You know, you'll see you know, like the whole alt news political podcast sphere, the fact that, you know, more people are listening to that stuff than watching all of television news put together is kind of odd, right? And it's and it kind of it kind of throws into question like what is even legitimacy exactly? Because I also don't think that selling tons and tons of copies necessarily makes it the most important thing either. It just, there is this sort of mix up into like what actually it's getting harder and harder to tell like what is the center of gravity of culture in a way. And I guess maybe there never was one. Maybe the whole thing was kind of an illusion that there was one. And what's obvious now is that it's very diffuse with occasional, you know, peaks and valleys. I got sort of interested too, though, you know, you kind of mentioned one sort of route. So a lot of film and TV has some kind of scientific basis. I mean, even this Pluribus show you're talking about, that's by Vince Gilligan, who was making, you know, mostly realistic stuff other than his time at X-Files. And, you know, a lot of films are if not speculative fiction, they at least have elements of that. There's still a lot of sort of crime and romance and that kind of thing. But a huge portion of the box office, let's say, is speculative work now. But, you know, it's interesting when a writer makes their way into it, like a fiction writer, like a Philip K. Dick, or, you know, just recently, One Battle After Another, the Thomas Pynchon adaptation. It's not like when you sit down in the theater, it says Thomas Pynchon's One Battle After Another. Like, you actually, I bet a large proportion of people who went to see that movie or went to see whatever the last movie that was adapted from a Philip K. Dick work, I bet the majority of people who saw that still have no idea who Thomas Pynchon or Philip K. Dick are. It's just that's interesting. I guess maybe I'm more sensitive to that as a writer. Where I'm like, say who came up with the freaking idea somewhere.
Yeah.
Leonardo DiCaprio did not come up with one battle after another. He did a great job in the movie, but he did not come up with it. And when he says the words in the movie, those aren't Leonardo DiCaprio quotes.
It's the second P.T. Anderson adaptation of Pynchon, isn't it? Because he did Inherent Vice.
Yes,
I feel like Inherent
and it's
Vice
much looser. This one's much looser too. It's almost like more like inspired by than adapted. But
I feel like they maybe sold Inherent Vice a little bit more on the bona fides of Pynchon. But I totally take your point. I mean, for me, it's like one thing I find difficult is like YA dystopian fiction, right? So the authors of YA dystopian fiction are like banner writers, you know.
Yes.
But like things like The Hunger Games, a lot of these kind of YA dystopias, you can see why they're incredibly popular. But they kind of take a lot of stuff that's already been done in science fiction, and they do it again, but they use it as like a backdrop for something else. And I guess the same thing is happening in kind of like romantasy, which is the biggest selling genre at the moment, is that it has the fantasy tropes and it has the fantasy world building that, you know, your mama liked, but it's also about which boy you're going to pick out of the love triangle, you know. And I wrote a little bit about this in The Darkest Timeline. I think like it's not a dystopia if it's escapist. Like dystopian fiction is an incredibly strong literary tradition, which is about kind of playing what if with themes from the present rather than trying to predict the future. And arguably PKD was a dystopian writer in that regard. I think when you start to use dystopias as like the furniture for a plot which is pure escapism, you really risk kind of devaluing the whole enterprise. And also it's a way of not dealing with everything in the present, which is the opposite of what dystopian fiction sets out to do. Like if dystopian fiction sets out to wake you up to the horrors of the present, then having escapist dystopian fiction means that you can avoid thinking about the horrors of the present, you know, even as your world around you becomes more actually dystopian. So I think that's actually like quite a malign genre. And maybe that's, maybe there's something there about why the writers of things like The Hunger Games are like better known than Thomas Pynchon. I don't know.
That's it. That's very interesting. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I haven't even really thought about this dystopian YA dystopia, but that is a huge sort of
it's gigantic,
market, isn't it? It's
I mean, I think it's kind of died down now. Yeah. It's I don't know. I mean, again, I'm like excluding myself from this critique as if I'm some serious writer. But when I was in my early 20s, I was trying to sell a book that was very much like a proto YA dystopia. I think, you know, maybe if I'd lucked out and managed to find an agent and sell it, I'd be sitting on some Netflix money right now. But yeah, you know,
just smoking a cigar and being like, who cares?
Yeah, but I was a fan of dystopian fiction, and I was trying to find a way into it that would have been accessible for like teen readers. So you know, I think the moment for that stuff is somewhat past. I think it would be hard to establish a new Hunger Games now. I think things have moved back towards fantasy. Romance is the genre that dominates now. Think about how poorly people thought of romance novels 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Like romance,
the trash of trash.
It was the trash of trash. So going back to PKD, how people thought of Mills and Boon, like, you know, Mills and Boon, that was just a byword for trash. Like people were reading it, weren't even really reading. They were just kind of like getting their giggles from it. That's how people thought of science fiction when Phil Dick was alive. It was just fun stuff to write. It didn't really matter. Like people used to ask Phil, so when are you going to publish a real book? This is like after he's won the Hugo and the Nebula. So that must have been really tough for him to never really be able to see his work taken seriously, except outside of like maybe a few conventions he attended where he was treated like the hero. So that's a sad aspect of his biography for me, for sure.
Yeah, and it is, but it is interesting that if he had, I mean, if Confessions of a Crap Artist had done really well, and a couple of his other more realistic books had come across, I don't think, and then that say he'd, well, then I don't need to write science fiction because I'm working in this lane. I don't think we'd be talking about him at all now. I think he'd
No.
be a sort of Wikipedia footnote, and yeah, he would be, he would be in that realm of a lot of other very talented people who wrote great books who just kind of aren't discussed anymore for whatever reason.
That's one reason I think Scanner Darkly is the best adaptation. I mean, first of all, it's a book that's nearly entirely grounded in reality. It has some science fiction concepts in it, sure. It has your classic PKD, like, drug that changes everything and is one of the plot points. But really at base, it's like quite a realistic portrait of a bunch of poor, down and out people involved in the drug culture. And the movie does a great job of adapting that. It is beat for beat what's in the book. There's zero deviations. There's large parts of the dialogue that are pulled straight from the book. So maybe something about that story and the way that he wrote it sort of like lent itself to a more faithful adaptation. But to me, like, obviously High Castle, because the idea of like an alternate history novel, that's a little bit more in people's yardstick. Like, what if the Nazis won the war is a fairly easy concept to glom onto. Even if once you get into the book, there's all this weird shit with the I Ching. But
Right.
Scanner is like a Beat Generation novel. It's about a bunch of people who are in a cultural moment experiencing a particular set of challenges. And it's funny too. Like, I think like there's one line from Scanner, which in one of the biographies you find out the origin of the line. The line is, if I'd known it was harmless, I'd have killed it myself. And the characters sort of like use this to torture the character of Barris, to sort of take the piss out of him.
Right.
Yeah, this was apparently a very highly strung friend of Phil's who found a spider in her bathroom and freaked out. And Phil went around with two other guys and they were going to deal with this spider. And they were like, it's totally harmless. And she said, well, fucking hell, if I'd known if it was harmless, I'd have killed it myself. That's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. No, that's a great book. And it's for, in terms of Philip K. Dick adaptations, it's Blade Runner and that to me are there's so many, not to be sort of snobbish about it, so many for me the Philip K. Dick adaptations are not very good.
But I mean, Blade Runner, right?
Watching it that much.
I mean, we could probably get into this topic for hours, but Blade Runner, Blade Runner is a fantastic movie. I mean, it's among other things, it's like the visual blueprint of cyberpunk, right?
Oh yeah.
But it's a terrible adaptation. Like the main character is nothing like the main character.
That's true.
The element of people having artificial pets and that whole plot that's driven by empathy for real creatures versus simulated creatures almost completely excised from the film. And the weirdest thing they took out was the religion in it. Do you remember the religion? It's like Mercerism. And that's, again, another really prescient Phil Dick concept where you grab the handles of the empathy box and then basically you go into Jesus's body, and he's not called Jesus, he's called Mercer, but he's proceeding up this rocky slope as people pelt him with rocks. And as you are pelted with rocks and you feel these rocks raining down on you, you empathize with him and you come together into some understanding of what it means to be human. Like, if you haven't put Mercerism in the film, it's not an adaptation. You just went, oh yeah, killing robots, that looks pretty cool. Let's do the killing robots thing, get a little bit of Chandler in there. So I love Blade Runner, but it's a pretty stinking adaptation.
That's a very good point. Yeah. It is missing quite a bit. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that Mercerism thing completely. But
I love Mercerism.
That really ties back to kind of what we're thinking. Philip K. Dick kind of pointing out empathy as sort of the way out, in a way, or the way out of being dehumanized, as a way to maintain your humanity against all of these forces that are sort of pulling you away from it, for sure.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I guess that's kind of all. We kind of hit everything that I wanted to talk about. For people who I posted that I was going to do this episode, and somebody mentioned, "Oh, I just read my first Philip K. Dick novel, and it was Three Stigmata." I know you said sort of your favorites, but what are, and maybe it's just those, but what are some other ones? Let's say somebody has just read Three Stigmata. It's the only Philip K. Dick they've read, and they're pretty stoked on him as a writer, and they are curious where to go next. Where do you think is sort of the next logical book to read from him?
I think if Three Stigmata was the first one you've read, you probably need to read Ubik next. Ubik is like a grand guignol kind of literary experiment in the same way that Eldritch is, but maybe it's a little more ambitious. I think, it's the most Borgesian of his books as well. Very much about like realities collapsing and withering around you. I think it has some really deep themes as well about like the subjective experience of losing your mind. I think Ubik really depicts that powerfully. But if you read out Three Stigmata and you just kind of like the wacky space stuff, I would say go to the short stories, because that was certainly kind of my first love there was the short stories. And there's just so many ideas packed in. I mean, if you're not familiar with Phil Dick as well, it's staggering how prolific he was. He wrote, hundreds of short stories. He wrote nearly, I think, like 21 published novels and a bunch that weren't published. So it's a huge canon to engage with. And I think it's important to say as well that, like, as a prose stylist, he's not the best writer in the world. No. He's definitely not even the best science fiction writer when it comes to the prose. It's the ideas, like reading Phil Dick's an experience of like mainlining concepts and ideas.
Yes.
And if you're not looking for a thing with a simple hero with simple goals, and you like a story about a complicated, sometimes difficult, maybe even unlikable person, there's just examples of that in everything that he's ever written. So yeah, but I think, Ubik, Scanner Darkly, Three Stigmata, Flow My Tears, these are, if I had to put together a top 10 of books of all time, at least 3 or 4 of those would be in there too. I don't think anyone really matches him for ideas, except maybe Borges.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. This year, I got the collected Borges short stories, and so I've read almost all of them. But this year, I just decided, like, on the side, when I have a few minutes, that's what I'm going to read over the course of the year. And I just finished it the other day. And yeah, there is this element. There are Philip K. Dick's closest literary maybe not closest literary ancestor. One of his closest literary ancestors is Borges. And I think there's also, and I'm sure somebody elsewhere has written about this or talked about it, I think there's actually some Kafka-esque elements to it that I think are generally sort of overlooked. And I mean, part of it is the way that each Kafka and Philip K. Dick ends up having this sort of bespoke theological crisis at the heart of everything, right? They're sort of, if you read something like Kafka's Blue Octavo notebooks, you see that he's sort of very much preoccupied with religion, but it's like he's got to figure it out for himself. And that's kind of what P.K. Dick's career, that's kind of always lurking in the background of PKD's career, especially, as you get into the exegesis years. So, yeah, really interesting to see. I mean, I think even when I first read Philip K. Dick, it was like this kooky science fiction writer. And now it seems like, no, he's on the same level as Kafka or Borges or,
and like we said
McCarthy.
earlier,
He's in the sort of, he's in the serious category now.
Yeah. And like we said earlier, becoming more and more prescient as the world gets weirder. I think that was what keeps interest in his work alive. There's some, probably you could argue, some superior science fiction writers. You might put Asimov or Herbert into those categories, but you don't speak of something being Asimovian or Herbert-esque. Whereas Phil Dickian, that's something that is a real thing, something that we encounter more and more. I found this one bit just about like the deceptive simplicity of the level at which his references and his symbolism operate. So this is Lawrence Sutin talking about
the name Palmer Eldritch. He says, a palm branch in Christian symbolism suggests the martyr's triumph over death. A palmer is a pilgrim who, as a sign of being to the Holy Land, or perhaps the Prox star system, carries a palm branch, or maybe the choosy lichen. And eldritch, of course, is a favorite adjective of Lovecraft. As for Leo Bolero, the lion appears in the prophecies of Ezekiel and is a symbol associated with Christ and the resurrection. So the choosy realm could be seen as a hellish Gnostic parallel to the Christian Eucharist. I mean, that's wild. Like the characters are not named in an abstract way. They're named in a way that carries a lot of weight and symbolism. So there's levels to unpack in Dick beyond just reading a fun story that, in the case of Three Stigmata, will scare you. You could probably spend a lifetime unpacking the crazy amounts of symbolism and dense knowledge and reading that went into the creation of these systems that each of his novels represents, you know?
Right. No, that's brilliant. I think that's a great place to leave it. Bram, there will be links to your work in the show notes for people who want to find you. Definitely go take a look at Bram's work. Keep an eye out for the Philip K. Dick book that he's got coming out next year. If you're subscribed here, you'll see it. I'll be retweeting it and whatever else. But I'm very much looking forward to that. And Bram, just thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. This was a great conversation.
Pleasure. Philip K. Dick is like one of my central nerd categories of things I could talk about forever.
I love it.
So thank you for giving me the chance to ramble on for a couple of hours.
Of course. That was great. Okay, everybody. As I said, if you are subscribed on the premium side, you're going to get access to the madness portion of this episode. I don't have it fully fleshed out yet, but there's going to be some interesting stuff. We're going to talk about the lore of Stigmata. We're going to talk about some people who at least claim to have lived in alternate dimensions, and a couple of other fun things for you there. And thanks. We'll see you on the next one.
Bye, everybody.